The humiliation was engineered with absolute, terrifying precision. Bradley was walking directly toward my table, his hand resting perfectly on the waist of his new wife. I had spent exactly 342 days rebuilding the foundation of my life, brick by agonizing brick. Now, he was here to tear it all down in front of the most powerful people in Chicago. The freezing wind off Lake Michigan rattled the massive glass windows of the Gold Coast ballroom, but the chill inside my chest was infinitely colder. I sat perfectly still in my dark velvet gown, feeling entirely out of place among the glittering, silk-draped elite of the city. I was an architect. I understood the brutal mathematics of gravity, the tensile strength of steel, and the unforgiving nature of concrete. I knew how to build structures that could withstand a Category 5 hurricane, but I had never figured out how to calculate the unpredictable, venomous variables of human emotion. The charity gala was a suffocating display of dark money and corporate vanity. The room smelled of expensive perfume, aged scotch, and the faint, metallic scent of cold rain on wool coats. I was only here because my firm was desperately trying to secure the final permits for a $50 million luxury hotel expansion in the Loop. My boss had demanded my presence, knowing my blueprints were the only thing keeping the project from collapsing under its own ambition. I took a slow, measured breath, forcing my heart rate to steady. I watched Bradley weave through the crowded tables, his eyes locked onto mine with a predatory, victorious gleam. He wore a $5,000 tuxedo that still somehow looked like a cheap costume on his shoulders. Bradley was a mid-level portfolio manager in the financial district. He was a man entirely driven by a fragile, insatiable ego and a desperate need to appear wealthy and dominant. He had left me a year ago, draining our joint accounts and leaving me to shoulder the crushing weight of a lease I could not afford. He had traded our 5-year relationship for a younger, more compliant model the moment my career began to eclipse his own. And now, she was clinging to his arm, Madison, 23 years old, a marketing assistant who thrived on the illusion of wealth. She was a decorative vine, entirely dependent on the fluctuating status of the man she was attached to. She wore a champagne-colored silk dress that left very little to the imagination, her blonde hair perfectly curled, her smile practiced and hollow. They were closing the distance, 30 feet, 20 feet. I locked my knees under the table. I pressed my calloused fingertips into the heavy velvet of my gown. I became a pillar of concrete. I refused to let him see the structural damage he had caused. "Evelyn," Bradley said, stopping at the edge of my table. His voice was loud, intentionally loud. He wanted the surrounding tables to hear. He wanted an audience for my execution. "I certainly did not expect to see you here," he continued, a smug, condescending smile stretching across his face. "I thought tickets to this event were reserved for the primary donors." I looked up at him, keeping my expression entirely sterile. "The firm purchased a table, Bradley. I am the senior architect on the downtown expansion. My presence was required." Madison leaned into his shoulder, her eyes wide and dripping with weaponized pity. "Oh, Evelyn," Madison breathed, her voice a high, breathy pitch that grated against my nerves like rusted metal. "It is so wonderful to finally meet you. Bradley has told me everything. I simply cannot imagine how difficult this past year has been for you. It was a calculated strike, a public reminder of my abandonment." I analyzed the structural weakness in Madison's posture, the way she leaned her entire body weight against Bradley, the way her eyes darted around the room to ensure people were watching her performance. She was hollow inside, a building with a beautiful facade and absolutely no load-bearing walls. "I have been quite well, Madison," I said, my voice low and perfectly level. "I have been busy working." Bradley let out a short, mocking laugh. He took a sip of his scotch, the ice clinking against the crystal glass. "Yes, working," Bradley said, shaking his head in mock sympathy. "Still drawing blueprints for other people's empires, Evelyn? I heard your firm was struggling to secure the funding for the new site. It must be exhausting, staying so stagnant while the rest of the city moves forward." The insult was designed to break me. He knew how hard I worked. He knew I spent 14 hours a day in a brightly lit drafting room, fighting with city inspectors and corrupt contractors to maintain the structural integrity of my designs. He resented my depth. He resented my independence. He had always wanted a woman who would look at him the way Madison did, like he was a god among men, rather than a mediocre finance bro playing with other people's money. "My career is exactly where it needs to be, Bradley," I replied, refusing to break eye contact. "I build things that last. I do not deal in temporary illusions." Bradley's jaw tightened. The subtle insult landed, but it only fueled his desire to humiliate me further. He leaned closer, placing his hands on the table, invading my physical space. The smell of his cologne was suffocating. "You always were too proud for your own good, Evelyn," Bradley sneered, dropping the polite facade. "Look at you, sitting here all alone in a dress that looks like it belongs in a funeral parlor. You do not belong in this room. You never did. You are just a glorified construction worker playing dress-up." The surrounding tables had gone quiet. The wealthy socialites and corporate executives were pretending to drink their champagne, but their eyes were fixed on our table. The social pressure was immense. I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks. I wanted to stand up. I wanted to throw my glass of sparkling water into his smug face. But that would only prove him right. That would only give him the hysterical, emotional reaction he was desperately trying to provoke. I took a breath, preparing to deliver a cold, calculated dismissal. But before I could speak, the atmospheric pressure in the ballroom violently dropped. It was not a sound. It was an absolute, terrifying absence of sound. The clinking glasses at the adjacent tables ceased entirely. The low hum of corporate gossip died in the throats of the city's elite. The string quartet in the corner seemed to falter, the music losing its rhythm as a heavy, suffocating tension flooded the room. A shadow detached itself from the velvet-draped archway behind me. I did not need to turn around to know who it was. The entire underworld of Chicago knew his name, even if they were too terrified to speak it aloud in public. Silas Vance. He was a shadow billionaire. A man who controlled the shipping yards, the real estate developments, and the dark, untraceable arteries of the city. The word Mafia was never spoken in his presence, but it did not need to be. His mere existence dictated absolute, unquestioning submission from everyone in his orbit. I felt the heat of his massive frame before I saw him. He stepped up directly behind my chair. The physical proximity was jarring. The freezing chill of the ballroom vanished, replaced by the radiating, dangerous warmth of his body. He moved with a predatory grace that defied his massive size. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit, tailored to absolute perfection, hiding a canvas of heavy, dark ink beneath the expensive silk. Silas did not look at Bradley. He did not acknowledge Madison. He looked down at me. His hand, heavy, warm, and calloused, settled firmly on the bare skin of my lower back, right where the velvet of my gown dipped low. A violent shiver wrecked through my spine. The touch was possessive. It was an undeniable public claim. "Mia Bella," Silas murmured. His voice was a deep, gravelly baritone that vibrated through the floorboards. It was soft, yet laced with a lethal authority that commanded the attention of every single person within 50 feet. "I leave you alone for 2 minutes," Silas continued, his thumb slowly tracing the ridge of my spine. "And you are already being swarmed by the local pests." The color completely drained from Bradley's face. He took a sudden, involuntary step backward, nearly knocking Madison off her high heels. Bradley recognized Silas. Every man in the financial district knew the shadow billionaire. They knew the stories of corporate rivals who had simply vanished from the industry, their assets liquidated, their reputations destroyed overnight. Silas finally lifted his gaze from me and turned his terrifying, hyper-competent stare toward Bradley. Silas's eyes were dark, empty, and completely devoid of human warmth. He looked at Bradley the way a man looks at a cockroach on a marble floor. "Bradley," Silas said, testing the name on his tongue like it tasted of dirt. "Portfolio manager, 3rd floor of the towering glass monument to mediocrity on Wacker Drive. You manage a pathetic little fund of $200 million. Bradley was physically shaking. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The $5,000 tuxedo suddenly looked like a cheap shroud wrapping a dead man. Madison shrank back, her decorative vine instinct finally realizing that the tree she was attached to was rotting from the inside out. She looked terrified, her eyes darting between Silas's massive frame and Bradley's trembling hands. Silas did not raise his voice. He spoke with razor-sharp, sterile corporate articulation, layered over a heavy, dangerous undertone that promised absolute violence. "You seem to have a fundamental misunderstanding of your place in this city, Bradley," Silas said smoothly. "You see, I acquired a 30% stake in your parent company this morning at 8 o'clock. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Bradley gasped, his eyes widening in pure, unadulterated horror. "Which means," Silas continued, taking one slow, deliberate step forward, forcing Bradley to retreat another foot. "Effectively, I own the chair you sit in. I own the desk you hide behind. I own the servers that hold your pathetic little client list. And I own the fragile, transparent illusion of a career you use to impress children." Silas glanced briefly at Madison, dismissing her entire existence with a single, cold look, before locking his eyes back onto Bradley. "Evelyn builds empires," Silas said, his voice dropping an octave, vibrating with a dark, smoldering intensity. "You play with digital pennies. Do not ever speak to her again. Do not look at her. Do not even breathe the same air as her in this city." Bradley swallowed hard, sweat beading on his forehead despite the freezing draft in the room. He was completely paralyzed by fear. Silas tilted his head, his expression turning lethal. "If you are still standing in my line of sight in 5 seconds, Silas whispered, the threat echoing in the silent ballroom, "I will freeze every account you have ever touched by 9 in the morning. I will liquidate your assets, call in the mortgage on your condo, and ensure you cannot get a job pouring coffee in this state. Walk away." Bradley did not hesitate. He turned and fled. He did not wait for Madison. He practically shoved his way through the crowd of silent onlookers, his fragile ego entirely shattered, his public humiliation absolute and irreversible. Madison let out a small, pathetic squeak, hiking up her champagne silk dress and scurrying after him, her heels clicking frantically against the marble floor. The silence in the ballroom remained heavy and suffocating. The surrounding tables slowly, nervously turned back to their conversations, terrified to draw Silas's attention. Silas's hand was still resting on my lower back. His thumb resumed its slow, hypnotic tracing of my spine. I stood up. I turned to face him, forcing myself to ignore the massive height difference between us. I had to tilt my head back to meet his dark, unreadable eyes. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a chaotic mixture of adrenaline, shock, and a dangerous, undeniable heat. I refused to be a damsel in distress. I refused to be another asset he had just acquired. "I did not need your help," I said, my voice trembling slightly, but holding its structural integrity. I had the situation entirely under control. Silas looked down at me. The lethal, terrifying aura that had just destroyed Bradley slowly dissolved, replaced by a dark, smoldering amusement. A slow smirk played at the corner of his lips. He looked at me not with pity, and not with the superficial lust of the men in the financial district. He looked at me with profound, unsettling respect. He respected my fire. He respected the unyielding foundation of my character. "I know you did not need my help, Evelyn," Silas said softly, his gravelly voice washing over me like warm rain. "I have read your blueprints. I know exactly how strong you are." I frowned, my mind racing to comprehend how the most dangerous billionaire in Chicago knew my name, let alone my architectural designs. "Then why did you intervene?" I demanded, crossing my arms over my chest, trying to build a physical barrier between us. Silas took a half step closer, effortlessly breaching my defenses. The scent of cedar, cold rain, and dark money wrapped around my senses, intoxicating and dangerous. "Because he was annoying me," Silas replied smoothly. "And because he is still watching us from the coat check across the hall." I blinked, my eyes darting toward the grand foyer. Through the glass doors, I could see Bradley standing near the exit, his face pale, watching us with a mixture of hatred and absolute defeat. "We need to finalize the illusion, Evelyn," Silas whispered, his gaze dropping to my lips. Before I could process the words, before I could calculate the risk or step away, Silas's large, calloused hand slid up from my lower back and wrapped firmly around my jaw. He tilted my head up and kissed me. It was a collision of absolute dominance and raw, consuming heat. It was not a stage kiss. It was not a polite, high society performance. It was a violent claiming. His lips were firm and demanding, parting mine with a ruthless efficiency that sent a shockwave of electricity straight down to my toes. The sterile, brightly lit world of my drafting room vanished. The cold, calculating logic of mathematics and physics shattered into a million pieces. I gasped into his mouth, my hands instinctively flying up to grip the lapels of his bespoke charcoal suit. The fabric was incredibly soft, but the muscle beneath it was like solid granite. He tasted of expensive scotch and dark, dangerous promises. He pulled me flush against his massive frame, eliminating the space between us, forcing me to feel the heavy, steady beating of his heart against my chest. For a moment, I surrendered. I let the crushing weight of the past year melt away in the inferno of his touch. I kissed him back, matching his intensity, pouring all of my repressed rage, my exhaustion, and my buried desires into the connection. A low, primal groan vibrated in his chest. His grip on my jaw tightened, his thumb stroking my cheekbone as he deepened the kiss, completely oblivious to the hundreds of wealthy socialites watching us in stunned silence. Finally, slowly, he pulled back. My chest was